Just sit down in that chair, Watson. I want to put you in touch with the situation, as I may need your help tonight. Let me show you the evolution of this case so far as I have been able to follow it. Simple as it has been in its leading features, it has nonetheless presented surprising difficulties in the way of an arrest. There are gaps in that direction which we have still to fill. We will go back to the note which was handed to Garcia upon the evening of his death. We may put aside this idea of Baines that Garcia's servants were concerned in the matter. The proof of this lies in the fact that it was he who had arranged for the presence of Scott Eccles, which could only have been done for the purpose of an alibi. It was Garcia, then, who had an enterprise, and apparently a criminal enterprise, in hand that night, in the course of which he met his death. I say criminal because only a man with a criminal enterprise desires to establish an alibi. Who, then, is most likely to have taken his life? Surely the person against whom the criminal enterprise was directed. So far it seems to me that we are on safe ground. We can now see a reason for the disappearance of Garcia's household. They were all confederates in the same unknown crime. If it came off when Garcia returned, any possible suspicion would have been warded off by the Englishman's evidence, and all would be well. But the attempt was a dangerous one, and if Garcia did not return by a certain hour, it was probable that his own life had been sacrificed. It had been arranged, therefore, that in such a case his two subordinates were to make for some pre-arranged spot where they could escape investigation and be in a position afterwards to renew their attempt. That would fully explain the facts, would it not? But why should one servant return? We can imagine that in the confusion of flight, something precious, something which he could not bear to part with, had been left behind. That would explain his persistence, would it not? Well, what is the next step? The next step is the note received by Garcia at dinner. It indicates a confederate at the other end. Now, where was the other end? I have already shown you that it could only lie in some large house, and that the number of large houses is limited. My first days in this village were devoted to a series of walks, in which, in the intervals of my botanical researches, I made a reconnaissance of all large houses, and an examination of the family history of the occupants. One house, and only one, riveted my attention. It is the famous old Jacobean Grange of High Gable, 1 mile on the farther side of Oxshott, and less than half a mile from the scene of the tragedy. The other mansions belong to prosaic and respectable people who live far aloof from romance. But Mr. Henderson of High Gable was by all accounts a curious man, to whom curious adventures might befall. I concentrated my attention therefore upon him and his household. A singular set of people, Watson. A singular set of people. The man himself the most singular of them all. I managed to see him on a plausible pretext, but I seemed to read in his dark, deep-set, brooding eyes that he was perfectly aware of my true business. He is a man of 50, strong, active, with iron-grey hair, great bunched black eyebrows, the step of a deer, and the air of an emperor. A fierce, masterful man, with a red-hot spirit behind his parchment face. He is either a foreigner or has lived long in the tropics, for he is yellow and sapless, but tough as a whipcord. His friend and secretary, Mr. Lucas, is undoubtedly a foreigner, chocolate brown, wily, suave, and cat-like, with a poisonous gentleness of speech. You see, Watson, we have come already upon 2 sets of foreigners, one at Wisteria Lodge and one at High Gable. So our gaps are beginning to close. These 2 men, close and confidential friends, are the center of the household. But there is one other person who, for our immediate purpose, may be even more important. Henderson has 2 children, girls of 11 and 13. Their governess is Miss Burnett, an Englishwoman of 40 or thereabouts. There is also one confidential manservant. This little group forms the real family, for they travel about together, and Henderson is a great traveller, always on the move. It is only within the last weeks that he has returned, after a year's absence, to High Gable. I may add that he is enormously rich, and whatever his whims may be, he can very easily satisfy them. For the rest, his house is full of butlers, footmen, maid-servants, and the usual overfed, underworked staff of a large English country house. So much I have learned, partly from the village gossip, and partly from my own observation. There are no better instruments than discharged servants with a grievance, and I was lucky enough to find one. I call it luck, but it would not have come my way had I not been looking out for it. As Baines remarks, we all have our systems. It was my system which enabled me to find John Warner, the late gardener of a High Gable, sacked in a moment of temper by his imperious employer. He in turn had friends among the indoor servants, who unite in their fear and dislike of their master. So I had my key to the secrets of the establishment. Curious people, Watson. I don't pretend to understand all yet, but very curious people anyway. It's a double-winged house, and the servants live on one side, the family on the other. There's no link between the two, save for Henderson's own servant, who serves the family's meals. Everything is carried to a certain door, which forms the one connection. Governess and children hardly go out at all, except into the garden. Henderson never by any chance walks alone. His dark secretary is like his shadow. The gossip among the servants is that their master is terribly afraid of something. Sold his soul to the devil in exchange for money, says Warner, and expects his creditors to come up and claim his own. Where they came from, or who they are, nobody has any idea. They are very, very violent. Twice Henderson has lashed at folks with his dog-whip, and only his long purse and heavy compensation have kept him out of the courts. Well now, Watson, let us judge the situation by this new information. We may take it that the letter came out of this strange household and was an invitation to Garcia to carry out some attempt which had already been planned. Who wrote the note? It was someone within the citadel, and it was a woman. Who then but Miss Burnett, the governess? All of our reasoning seems to point that way. At any rate, we may take it as a hypothesis and see what consequences it would entail. I may add that Miss Burnett's age and character make it certain that my first idea that there might be a love interest in our story is out of the question. If she wrote the note, she was presumably the friend and confederate of Garcia. What then might she be expected to do if she heard of his death? If he met in some nefarious enterprise, her lips might be sealed. Still, in her heart, she must retain bitterness and hatred against those who had killed him, and would presumably help so far as she could to have revenge upon them. Could we see her, then, and try to use her? That was my first thought. But now we come to a sinister fact. Miss Burnett has not been seen by any human eye since the night of the murder. From that evening she has utterly vanished. Is she alive? Has she perhaps met her end on the same night as the friend whom she had summoned? Or is she merely a prisoner? There is the point which we still have to decide. You will appreciate the difficulty of the situation, Watson. There is nothing upon which we can apply for a warrant. Our whole scheme might seem fantastic if laid before a magistrate. The woman's disappearance counts for nothing, since in that extraordinary household any member of it might be invisible for a week, and yet she may at the present moment be in danger of her life. All I can do is to watch the house and leave my agent Warner on guard at the gates. We can't let such a situation continue. If the law can do nothing, we must take the risk ourselves. What do you suggest? I know which is her room. It is accessible from the top of an outhouse. My suggestion is that you and I go tonight and see if we can strike at the very heart of the mystery. It was not, I must confess, a very alluring prospect. The old house with its atmosphere of murder, the singular and formidable inhabitants, and the unknown dangers of the approach, and the fact that we were putting ourselves legally in a false position, all combined to dampen my ardor. But there was something in the ice-cold reasoning of Holmes which made it impossible to shrink from any adventure which he might recommend. One knew that thus, and only thus, could a solution be found. I clasped his hand in silence, and the die was cast. But it was not destined that our investigation should have so adventurous an ending. It was about 5 o'clock, and the shadows of the March evening were beginning to fall, when an excited rustic rushed into our room.
"They've gone, Mr. Holmes. They went by last train. The lady broke away, and I've got her in a cab downstairs."
Excellent, Warner. Excellent. Watson, the gaps are closing rapidly. In the cab was a woman, half collapsed from nervous exhaustion. She bore upon her aquiline and emaciated face the traces of some recent tragedy. Her head hung listless upon her breast, but as she raised it and turned her dull eyes upon us, I saw that her pupils were dark dots in the center of the broad grey iris. She was drugged with opium.
"I watched at the gate, Mr. Holmes, same as you advised. When the carriage came out, I followed it to the station. She was like one walking in a sleep. But when they tried to get her into the train, she came to life and struggled. They pushed her into the carriage. She fought her way out again. I took her part, got her into the cab, and here we are. I shan't forget the face of the carriage window as I led her away. I'd have a short life if he had his way, the black-eyed, scowling, yellow devil."
We carried her upstairs, laid her upon the sofa, and a couple of cups of the strongest coffee soon cleared her brain from the mist of the drug. Baines had been summoned by Holmes, and the situation rapidly explained to him.
"Why, sir, you've got me the very evidence I want. I was on the same scent as you from the first."
What? You were after Henderson?
"Why, Mr. Holmes, when you were crawling in the shrubbery at Highgate, I was up one of the trees in the plantation and saw you down below. It was just who would get the evidence first."
Then why did you arrest the mulatto?
I was sure Henderson, as he calls himself, felt that he was suspected, and that he would lie low and make no move so long as he thought he was in any danger. I arrested the wrong man to make him believe that our eyes were off him. I knew he would be likely to clear off then, and give us a chance at getting at Miss Burnett.
You will rise high in your profession. You have instinct and intuition.
I've had plainclothesmen waiting at the station all the week. Wherever the High Gable folk go, he will keep them in sight. But he must have been hard put to it when Miss Burnett broke away. However, your man picked her up, and it all ends well. We can't arrest without her evidence, that is clear. So the sooner we get a statement, the better.
Every minute she gets stronger. But tell me, Baines, who is this man Henderson?
Henderson is Don Mario, once called the Tiger of San Pedro.
The Tiger of San Pedro! The whole history of the man came back to me in a flash. He had made his name as the most lewd and bloodthirsty tyrant that had ever governed any country with a pretense of civilization. Strong, fearless, and energetic, he had sufficient virtue to enable him to impose his odious vices upon a cowering people for 10 or 12 years. His name was a terror through all Central America. At the end of that time, there was a universal rising against him, but he was as cunning as he was cruel, and at the very whisper of coming trouble, he had secretly conveyed his treasures aboard a ship which was manned by devoted adherents. It was an empty palace which was stormed by the insurgents the next day. The dictator, his 2 children, his secretary, and his wealth had all escaped them. From that moment he had vanished from the world, and his identity had been a frequent subject for comment in the European press.
Yes, sir, Don Mario, the Tiger of San Pedro. If you look it up, you will find that the San Pedro colors are green and white, same as in the note, Mr. Holmes. Henderson, he called himself, but I traced him back, Paris and Rome and Madrid to Barcelona, where his ship came in '86. They've been looking for him all the time for their revenge, but it is only now that they have begun to find him out.
They discovered him a year ago. Once already his life has been attempted, but some devil spirit shielded him. Now again it is the noble chivalrous Garcia who has fallen, while the monster goes safe. But another will come, and yet another, until someday justice will be done. That is as certain as the rise of tomorrow's sun.
But how come you into this matter, Miss Burnett? How can an English lady join in such a murderous affair?
I joined in it because there is no other way in the world by which justice can be gained. What does the law of England care for the rivers of blood shed years ago in San Pedro, or for the shipload of treasures which this man has stolen? To you they are like crimes committed in some other planet. But we know. We have learned the truth in sorrow and in suffering. To us there is no fiend in hell like Juan Mario, and no peace in life while his victims still cry for vengeance.
No doubt. He was, as you say. I have heard that he was atrocious. But how are you affected?
I will tell you it all. This villain's policy was to murder, on one pretext or another, every man who showed such promise that he might, in time, come to be a dangerous rival. My husband, yes, my real name is Signore Victor Dorando, was the San Pedro minister in London. He met me and married me there. A nobler man never lived upon the earth. Unhappy Mario heard of his excellence, recalled him on some pretext, and had him shot. With a premonition of his fate, he had refused to take him with him. His estates were confiscated, and I was left with a pittance and a broken heart. Then came the downfall of the tyrant. He escaped, as you have just described. But the many whose lives have been ruined, whose nearest and dearest had suffered, tortured, and death at his hands, would not let the matter rest. They banded themselves into a society which should never be dissolved until the work was done. It was my part, after we had discovered in the transformed Henderson that the fallen despot, to attach himself to his household and to keep the others in touch with his movements. This I was able to do by securing the position of governess in his family. He little knew that the woman who faced him at every meal was the woman whose husband he had hurried into an hour's notice into eternity. I smiled on him, did my duty to his children, and bided my time. An attempt was made in Paris and failed. We zigzagged swiftly here and there over Europe to throw over the pursuers and finally returned to this house, which he had taken upon his first arrival in England. But here also the ministers of justice were waiting, knowing that he would return there. Garcia, who is the son of the former highest dignitary in San Pedro, was waiting with two thirsty companions of humble station. All three fired with same reasons for revenge. He could do little during the day, for Mario took every precaution and never went out save for his satellite Lucas, or Lopez, as he was known in the days of his greatness. At night, however, he slept alone, and the avenger might find him. On a certain evening, which had been prearranged, I sent my friend final instructions, for the man was forever on the alert and continually changed his room. I was to see that the doors were open, and the signal of a green and white light in a window which faced the drive was to give notice if all was safe, or if the attempt had better be postponed. But everything went wrong with us. In some way I had excited the suspicion of Lopez, the secretary. He crept up behind me and sprang upon me just as I had finished the note. He and his master dragged me to my room and held judgment upon me as a convicted traitress. Then and there they would have plunged their knives into me, could they have seen how to escape the consequences of the deed. Finally, after much debate, they concluded that my murder was too dangerous, but they determined to get rid forever of Garcia. They had gagged me, and Murillo twisted my arm round until I gave him the address. I swear that he might have twisted it off had I understood what it had meant to Garcia. Lopez addressed the note which I had written, sealed it with his sleeve link, and sent it to the hand of the servant, Jose. How they murdered him, I do not know, save that it was Murillo's hand who struck him down, for Lopez had remained to guard me. I believe he must have waited among the gorse bushes, through which the path winds, and struck him down as he passed. At first, they were of a mind to let him enter the house and to kill him as a detected burglar. But they argued that if they were mixed up in an inquiry, their own identity would at once be publicly disclosed, and they would be open for further attacks. With the death of Garcia, the pursuit might cease, since such a death might frighten others from the task. All would now have been well for them, had it not been for my knowledge of what they had done. I had no doubt that there were times when my life hung in the balance. I was confined to my room, terrorized by the most horrible threats, cruelly ill-used to break my spirit. See this stab on my shoulder, and the bruises from end to end of my arm, and the gag was thrust into my mouth, and on the one occasion when I tried to call from the window. For 5 days this cruel imprisonment continued, with hardly enough food to hold body and soul together. This afternoon, a good lunch was brought me, but the moment after I took it, I knew that I had been drugged. In a sort of dream, I remember being half led, half carried to the carriage. In the same state, I was conveyed to the train. Only then, when the wheels were almost moving, did I suddenly realize that my liberty lay in my own hands. I sprang out. They tried to drag me back, and had it not been for the help of this good man who led me to the cab, I should never have broken away. Thank God now, thank God I am beyond their power forever.
Our difficulties are not over. Our police work ends, but our legal work begins.
Exactly. A plausible lawyer could make it out as an act of self-defense. There may be 100 crimes in the background, but it is only on this one that they can be tried.
Come. I think better of the law than that. Self-defense is one thing. To entice a man in cold blood with the object of murdering him is another. Whatever danger you may fear from him. No, we shall all be justified when we see the tenants of High Gable at the next Guildford Assizes.
Time was still to elapse before the Tiger of San Pedro should meet with his deserts. Wily and bold, he and his companion threw their pursuers off their track by entering a lodging house in Edmonton Street and leaving by the back gate into Curzon Street. From that day they were seen no more in England. Some 6 months afterwards, the Marquis of Montalvo and Signor Rulli, his secretary, were both murdered in their rooms at the Hotel Escurial at Madrid. The crime was ascribed to nihilism, and the murderers were never arrested. With the printed description of the dark face of the secretary, and the masterful features, the magnetic black eyes, and the tufted brows of his master, we could not doubt that justice, if belated, had come at last.
A chaotic case, my dear Watson. It will not be possible for you to present that compact form which is so dear to your heart. It covers 2 continents, concerns 2 groups of mysterious persons, and is further complicated by the highly respectable presence of our friend Scott Eccles, whose inclusion shows me that the deceased Garcia had a scheming mind and well-developed instinct of self-preservation. It is remarkable only for the fact that amid a perfect jungle of possibilities, we, with our worthy collaborator, the inspector, have kept our close hold on the essentials, and so been guided along the crooked and winding path. Is there any point which is not quite clear to you? Well, the object of the mulatto cook's return. I think the strange creature in the kitchen may account for it. The man was a primitive savage from the backwoods of San Pedro, and this was his fetish. When his companion and he had fled to some prearranged retreat, already occupied, no doubt by a confederate, the companion had persuaded him to leave so compromising an article of furniture. But the mulatto's heart was with it, and he was driven back to it the next day, when, on reconnoitering through the window, he found Policeman Walters in possession. He waited 3 days longer, and then his piety, or his superstition, drove him to try once more. Inspector Baines, who with his usual astuteness had minimized the incident before me, had really recognized its importance, and had left a trap in which the creature walked. Any other point, Watson? The torn bird, the pail of blood, the charred bones, all the mystery of that weird kitchen. I spent a morning in the British Museum reading up on that and other points. Here is a quotation from Eckermann's Voodooism and Primitive Religions. The true voodoo worshipper attempts nothing of importance without certain sacrifices which are intended to propitiate his unclean gods. In extreme cases, these rites take the form of human sacrifices, followed by cannibalism. The more usual victims are a white cock, which is plucked in pieces alive, or a black goat, whose throat is cut, blood drained, and body burned. So you see, our savage friend was very orthodox in his ritual. It is grotesque, Watson. But, as I have had occasion to remark, there is but one step from the grotesque to the horrible.
Final chapter of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes on the Joe Bev Show. Next time, we'll have W.C. Fields as the Red Hornet, and the first Yours Truly Johnny Dollar episode, The Suicidal Bicycle Matter. That's next time on the Joe Bev Show. Like what you hear? Just go to Amazon and search for Joe Bev.